Welcome to the panel on taking the gamble out of reuse risks. What we hope to do is to talk about some recent technical and regulatory developments that have brought issues that present reuse risks and the level of uncertainty with these risks as they pertain to brownfields redevelopment. The panel will present reuse risks associated with two primary issues, and those are the compounds of PFAS, which are emerging contaminants of concern, as well as vapor intrusion risks. My name is Brandt, principal with Geosyntec Consultants, and I'll be your primary dealer today. And I have two of my esteemed colleagues, Gordon Hart, who is the King of Kings, and Mr. Barry Geisler, who's our ace in the hole today. And what we hope that you will learn is about the specific risks that these issues pose to future reuse opportunities, the regulatory environment around these developing issues, and potential risk management tools that are available through environmental insurance.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Gordon Hart. I have 30 years of experience working on various environmental issues related to the redevelopment of property. I've done a lot of work on military bases, rail yards, shipyards, manufacturing facilities, power plants, etc.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barry Geisler. I have been in the environmental insurance industry for about 25 years. And our company writes environmental products throughout the United States and internationally. We work with brokers and wholesalers and insureds, and we specialize in the redevelopment of distressed properties.
So what I'd like to start off with is over the past 20 years, the brownfields industry has been dealt a couple of important hands. One in regards to regulatory protections. In 2004, CERCLA brownfields protections were passed, which provided significant opportunities for developers and reusers of contaminated property to move forward with development and have some liability protections under CERCLA. And then in 2018, those protections were strengthened through the BUILD Act. In addition to the regulatory protections, we've also had significant advancements in grant funding and other funding programs. The EPA brownfields grants have continued to be strong and in fact have grown a little bit. Hopefully they can grow some more in the future. Many states have adopted grant programs or state revolving loan fund programs. And there's also been local advances in financing such as tax increment financing and development reuse financing. There have also been significant advances in environmental insurance programs, primarily in the way of refinements of pollution legal liability insurance policies. Barry, maybe you can start off with just a brief overview from your perspective on the insurance industry.
Yeah, so the environmental insurance industry grew out of a change in the general liability market about 30 years or so ago when the absolute pollution exclusion began to be added to commercial general liability policies, primarily in response to some toxic tort issues. The industry grew out of that, as I mentioned, as a result of a need that began to present itself on a more and more frequent basis. As the country went towards more environmental protection with laws like CERCLA and RCRA, there grew an increasing need for this type of insurance coverage. At this point, the market is somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.5 to $5 billion annually. But there are only a few carriers who are really interested in working on brownfields redevelopments. There are all kinds of different products out there, all kinds of different carriers, but the industry really developed out of a need to address CERCLA and RCRA liability and has really expanded from there.
Great, thanks so much, Barry. And Gordon, help us to understand some of the advances in the regulatory protections that we've seen.
Well, I would note that in addition to the CERCLA brownfield protections that created the bona fide prospective purchaser defense, BFPP, California, and I'll probably be pretty California specific in my comments today. California has the CLARA Act, which passed about a decade ago, California Land Reuse and Revitalization Act, which provides for some broad protections for prospective purchasers. And California and US EPA also have, not by statute, but by policy, the authority to enter into prospective purchaser agreements, PPAs, to also protect people. On a more general note, I would just say that over the last 20 years or so, environmental issues, contaminated property issues in particular in real estate transactions, have gone from the kind of oh shit category 20 years ago to the oh well category. And what I mean by that is if you found out that there was significant contamination on a property you were considering buying or developing, they were a potential deal killer. Now I think they're just another obstacle like entitlement risk, like market risk, that is baked into people's calculations. People know how to deal with it. They know they have to conduct due diligence, know there's insurance available, know there is some level of risk, and it isn't quite as scary as it used to be, at least to the sophisticated buyer developer.
Great, thanks very much, Gordon. So what I'd like to do now is dive into the two challenges that we've identified and start off with talking about PFAS compounds. PFAS compounds are a class of compounds that are based on molecules that have a carbon-fluorine architecture. And the most famous compounds are perfluorooctanoic acid, or commonly known as PFOA, PFOA, as well as perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, or PFOS. But there are literally thousands of compounds that are based on this carbon-fluorine architecture, which is very interesting because it represents the shortest and strongest molecular bond known in nature. And that means that it is both a trump card as well as a wild card. The good news side of it is that the compound has some very unique chemical properties that make it attractive for thousands of commercial products. Probably the most common of which is AFFF, also known as firefighting foam, which has been used in the firefighting industry for decades and has been applied in fires in just about every type of situation. It also has very good properties that make it attractive for things like Gore-Tex, rain and water resistant fabrics, things like Teflon, coatings on cooking utensils that make food slide off of it easily. And so these compounds have been in the environment for many, many years. The bad news, the wild card side of these compounds, is they're very persistent in nature and very resistant to degradation. They're very expensive to clean up and remove from the environment. PFAS chemistry is complicated and the mixtures are complex. There's a lot of research and development going on in the toxicology world. Understanding of these compounds, regulations are evolving. And the tough part about it is these compounds are virtually present almost everywhere, and treatment options are limited. Gordon, I'd like you to talk a little bit about some of the legal challenges that we have around these PFAS compounds.
Because this is an emerging issue, officially designated by regulatory agencies as an emerging contaminant, it also has an emerging regulatory structure. There are more questions than answers. In some states, there has been more work on developing standards and guidance than in California, where there has not been much. So largely, we have more questions than answers. One answer we do have is we do know that in California, there have been directives coming from agencies, the Regional Water Board, but also DTSC, to select types of facilities deemed to have a high probability of having PFAS issues, to investigate and try to determine the scope of the problem. For example, an order went out to every landfill in the state. Basically, every military base is having investigations done at this stage, or will be having them done soon by the services. Airports, metal plating facilities, are there other types of facilities that are getting directives to determine the scope of the problem? The real set of questions is what happens if you find it, and what can agencies do about it? This question, to some degree, comes from the fact that these substances are not regulatorily listed as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. So there isn't the kind of clear regulatory framework that exists, for the 40 years now that CERCLA has been around to guide how to clean this up and what the liability scheme is and what the agency authorities are. In California, there is certainly legal authority under the Water Code to look at these issues, probably RCRA as a hazardous waste constituent. But California has not issued any cleanup standards to guide exactly, if you find it, at what level must you clean it up and at what level must you clean it up to. And one just has to, I think, work with the regulatory agencies to determine what to do. The most important issue to the agencies is if there's a source of drinking water. And if there's a source of drinking water, then it's going to get a lot of attention. If there's not, as there's not in so many developments that we see, particularly, coastal type developments, as to what in a non-drinking water environment the regulatory standards are going to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just learned yesterday that the LA Regional Water Quality Control Board has issued a Water Code 13267 directive to wastewater treatment plants to investigate their facilities. And Barry, you've got a great example about a wastewater treatment plant case.
Yeah, and this was not necessarily a California situation, but we were made aware of a rather significant claim that did involve a redevelopment. So an entity had purchased a brownfield, prior industrial location, and redeveloped it into a warehouse. Although the insured never used or stored PFAS chemicals at its location, it became embroiled in some significant litigation because it was upstream of a wastewater treatment plant. And so all of the industrial facilities that in the past had sent their wastewater to this particular treatment plant got named in a lawsuit by the municipality who owned the wastewater treatment plant after PFAS was detected in the effluent from the treatment facility. So this particular individual company thought he was doing something good, redeveloped the brownfield, repurposed it into a piece of property that developed, taxes for the municipality and created jobs. But unfortunately, the wastewater treatment plant had to expend a great deal of money to update their system to begin to remove PFAS from its effluent before it was discharged. And they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, every developer's worst nightmare. So let's talk a little bit about how to reduce some of these risks associated with PFAS compounds. Let me start off talking about a phase one environmental due diligence when taking on any property, especially potentially contaminated property. Currently, PFAS compounds are not listed as CERCLA hazardous substances. So that creates a bit of a conundrum in terms of a phase one environmental due diligence because the ASTM standard identifies recognized environmental conditions, historical environmental conditions, or controlled environmental conditions as being referenced to CERCLA hazardous substances. But we all know that there's a joker in the deck somewhere, and sometime these PFAS compounds are going to be listed as CERCLA hazardous substances probably pretty soon. So anybody buying property right now probably should know whether there are PFAS compounds or the potential for PFAS compounds on their property. So how do you deal with that in the context of a phase one environmental site assessment report when you can't call them a REC, an HREC, or a CREC? Well, I've seen some consultants write in their reports, identify them as RECs, which is just technically not correct. So beware of that. But there are a couple of avenues that you can identify PFAS compounds in a phase one report. One is to identify it as a business environmental risk. It's an environmental condition that does not fall in one of the three environmental condition categories defined in ASTM, but it's a business risk that may come into play down the future that the developer should be aware of and should plan in some contingencies for in his development of the property. You can also identify it as a data gap, which is a gray area, but it is an avenue to say there's potential for PFAS compounds to be there. There's a data gap because it's not yet regulated. It's not yet known to be specifically on the site. Buyer beware, go in with your eyes open. There are ways that I've seen this issue handled so that the developer or the buyer is alerted should they become regulated as hazardous substances. Following the phase one, you have the issue of whether to investigate or not investigate PFAS compounds. And this creates a whole nother host of other issues and wild cards. You have to be careful that you don't falsely introduce contaminants from your sampling apparatus, from other elements in the environment surrounding the site, surrounding your sampling site that could come into play. And you will virtually have a good opportunity to identify PFAS compounds everywhere that may or may not have originated from your site. So sorting out the detections as to where they came from, what the source was, if it's part of the site, not knowing cleanup criteria or regulatory criteria, and whether it'll have to get cleaned up at all or not, all create questions and uncertainty in the deck of cards that we have. Gordon, maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the implications of this not being a hazardous substance.
One would think that not being a hazardous substance is a good thing for an owner because, it means that there isn't liability under CERCLA for contamination for hazardous substances. However, given that there is potential liability under other statutes, and it's clear that at some point in time it will be deemed a hazardous substance, we're just not sure when. Not before the election, and probably not in the first year after the election, because it won't exactly be the highest priority, but fairly soon thereafter. The fact that you have this specter that could create liability, that where you don't have the structure and the mechanisms that you're used to, is concerning. For example, there wouldn't be bona fide prospective purchaser protection. Now, ostensibly, you don't need it, because you're not liable. But what happens, for example, once it becomes a hazardous substance and you have purchased property, would you be liable as a current owner because you hadn't necessarily qualified for BFPP protection beforehand because it wasn't a hazardous substance? And that, I think, goes back to what Randy was saying about, I think you need to work with your environmental consultants to treat it as much as possible like it were a hazardous substance in the manner that Randy was talking about, so you can demonstrate that you did everything that you would have done, that you should have done if it was a hazardous substance. The other trick with it not being a hazardous substance is that it means that if you do have to clean it up, you don't have the ability to have a contribution action under CERCLA for it. Now, there almost assuredly are other legal mechanisms, like just general tort law, that one could use against someone who contaminated your property with PFAS. And then finally, the issue is because the National Contingency Plan, the Superfund cleanup regulations, basically wouldn't apply at this point. What is the cleanup process, the actual steps that you take if you find it and to clean up? I think this issue is most tricky in a situation that is likely to occur at all of these sites that are getting orders to investigate PFAS. Many of them have ongoing cleanups that may be almost done, and for conventional contaminants. So what happens if suddenly you're ordered to, okay, you have found these possible sources, sample, you find some PFAS, does that mean you can't close your whole site? Does that mean could you get a no further action just for everything you were doing, because you're just about done, and then have like a carve out from the no further action for PFAS? And we're beginning to see some dialogue with agencies about that issue, and one should be able to negotiate something like that with agencies.
And Barry, how do PLL policies treat PFAS compounds if they're known to exist on site?
Very carefully. It's a very, very difficult thing to underwrite for all of the reasons that have been discussed here already. The lack of regulatory certainty, and many states are, how shall I put this, not really happy with the pace that the federal government is taking with regard to these particular issues, and are moving beyond what the EPA's guidance is. So we really have to take it into account on a site-by-site basis. What are the state rules that may be involved? What is the use of the site going to be? What is the likelihood that the groundwater will be used for any beneficial purpose? There's a lot of things that need to be taken into account. There are some carriers who will just generally not get involved in it and blanketly exclude PFAS at this point in time, especially if the site or something near the site is on the red flag list, those things that you mentioned before, plating facilities, airports, manufacturing facilities, anything like that. That's not the approach that we take. Again, we like to base our decisions based more on what we know about the site, what we know about the regulations, and what we can actually get comfortable with. But it's very, very difficult at this point in time because of all of the uncertainty that we've discussed here.
Yeah, sounds like it's very important to get a good set of advisors on board when you're looking at taking on property that may have PFAS.
Absolutely. And the phase one is critical too. Although it may not necessarily address PFAS, as you mentioned, what it's going to address is the history of the site, which is critical to understanding whether or not prior uses at the site may have had PFAS as part of their manufacturing or other processes.
Good. Let's turn quickly to vapor intrusion challenges. Most of us know that the toxicological information for TCE has been updated, and what has been reported is that it is more toxic at lower doses, and the big kicker is that it's been shown to be damaging to unborn fetuses, which has caused a lot of concern, obviously, for pregnant women in office buildings and residential buildings, even in commercial situations. As a result of that, the regulatory agencies have significantly lowered their screening criteria as a blanket condition for all sites. And they're in the process of updating their guidance documents to reflect a much higher level of conservatism when approaching sites that have TCE on them. In addition to just mitigating for potential vapor intrusion of TCE into airspaces, they've also taken a more aggressive stance on looking at source removal in conjunction with mitigation, which layers on an additional level of responsibility for any potential buyers of contaminated sites to really understand what they're getting into. And so the implications of the bona fide prospective purchaser status comes into question as to whether a buyer is obligated to clean up source material that they didn't cause, even if they mitigate the site so that it's safe for the intended use.
On that particular issue, I would just say that I don't think that someone who otherwise qualifies for BFPP protection would need to do source removal. That would be an unfair application of the reasonable steps requirement that you have to take as a bona fide prospective purchaser. On a more general matter, being California-centric, it is a bit of a mess as to how the agencies are looking at vapor intrusion. So, I won't go into it. The significant dispute has to do with the attenuation factor and the mathematical calculation that one should use. EPA had a screening level based on a very conservative attenuation factor, and the state started using that, or at least the regional water boards did, really almost as a cleanup standard rather than a screening level. Different boards were doing different things. DTSC was doing different things. At this point, to get a unified Cal EPA approach, that still has not happened. There's been various drafts that have come out and not finalized. So you do have a bit of a mess. The main issue is how much can you use site-specific information to be able to demonstrate that these conservative default assumptions about how much will get into the indoor air just aren't going to happen on this particular site because it's a very clayey soil, it's not permeable, et cetera. And some of the agencies are becoming more and more willing to look at site-specific issues, and some are still saying pregnant women are at potential risk. We're going to be super conservative and use defaults everywhere.
Yeah, so let's talk quickly about how to reduce the risk from this bad hand. I think Barry mentioned it earlier. Again, this issue hinges on having a good, solid environmental due diligence survey and report. And there's also, ASTM has also established a vapor encroachment standard that provides some guidance of how to look at whether any VOC vapors could encroach onto a property and pose a potential risk to future land users on the property. If there are data gaps identified in the report, it's important to investigate and close all those data gaps with respect to volatiles and the vapor encroachment issues, and identify the sources of those vapors so that you are not only prepared to mitigate it, but hopefully terminate the encroachment condition so that you're not left to mitigate a building in perpetuity. There are many mitigation options, and there are subtle nuances between all the options, and it's important to understand what those mean from a regulatory perspective, from a technical perspective, and from a long-term O&M perspective on the future site development. And it all hinges on developing a clear and defensible conceptual site model. What's going on in the subsurface and what are the risks posed to the building? Whether you need to use passive or active mitigation systems, what an effective monitoring and maintenance program really looks like to demonstrate effectiveness. And then if you need to, coupling source reduction and mitigation systems into one action so that you can achieve the maximum benefit to a site and hopefully reduce the O&M period, the long-term O&M period at the back end. Barry, tell us a little bit about coverage issues relative to VI, and if you have a good case example you can share with us.
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind. The first thing is we're seeing, especially in California and in many other jurisdictions, what we call reopeners. That is sites that have previously been closed, but as a result of the things that we've been talking about here, whether it be a change in the regulatory status or simply wanting to revisit vapor intrusion issues, entities have been asked to do indoor air sampling. And in many cases, as a result of that, they've had to either implement a passive system or in most cases an active system. And so we've seen a lot of requests now for coverage for those O&M costs going forward. In many instances, there will be a requirement to post financial assurance as part of the closure of this vapor intrusion issue. And so we've seen a lot of requests for an insurance policy that is put in place to cover that financial obligation in the event that the entity who's responsible to pay them can't or is unwilling or unable.
Good. Gordon, can you comment quickly on screening levels? Are they enforceable as cleanup standards, and how are the agencies approaching these issues?
I'd like to focus on a couple of legal issues that I think are really important for reducing risk in the vapor intrusion scenario.
Absolutely.
One is the issue of institutional controls. Unless the remedy used is simply scooping and hauling, which is not very standard other than very discrete hotspot removal, the remedy is going to have some kind of long-term component. If it's a vapor intrusion mitigation system, a vapor barrier, and particularly an active vapor barrier, or even if it involves source removal through a extraction system, those are going to be in place for some time and are no doubt going to ultimately become the responsibility, and certainly a vapor mitigation system will, of the subsequent owners, not the original developer who puts in the system. And so you have a whole suite of issues about, is that the homeowner association in a business park? Is that a building owners association? How do you demonstrate to the agency that that association has the authority to, and the resources and the obligation under their governing documents to take care of these systems for 30 years and or perpetuity, and there's a lot of legal issues associated with that, where you need to make sure that those governing documents and those financial assurance mechanisms are properly done, and then convince the regulatory agencies that they have been properly done. A related issue has to do with disclosure. This is particularly an issue in residential developments. It particularly becomes an issue in what Barry was talking about, these sites where there are reopeners happening. We've had a couple of sites where either the houses are about to be occupied, or literally some part of a development has been occupied and others haven't, where the regulatory agencies have come back in and said, we need you to do more work, or we need you to take what was going to be a passive barrier to an active barrier, or where in the course of the development of phase 2, you're doing some dewatering and sampling, and you find TCE that 5 years before wouldn't have been considered a problem and now is, because of the change in the standards. And there you get a really tricky issue about disclosing to homeowners that an agency is saying there may be water and vapor on the site that poses a risk to pregnant women. And you can't ignore that. You have to be straightforward with people about disclosing, in your subsequent, in the purchase and sale agreements, in the CC&Rs, et cetera. And you may even have to, mail out a fact sheet and have a community alert. And that obviously creates lots of tension between the business and marketing interests and the legal interests of making sure that you're not susceptible to a suit for non-disclosure.
Good. Thanks for sharing that. I'd just like to kind of summarize quickly. These are very complex issues, and they don't look like very good hands of cards that have been dealt to us. However, there are a couple of tools that are available to really make sure that you come away with a winning hand. One is retaining a technically qualified consultant and having somebody who's got good knowledge of science and technology, understanding the regulatory framework, and experience with multiple remediation technologies and applications is really important. And then having a good legal counselor and environmental insurance advisor are equally as critical. And maintaining active relationships with regulators. It's important to know what they're thinking, how they're regulating, and every regulator within the DTSC or regional board may respond differently. And it's good to establish a relationship, a meaningful relationship, just like you would with any other professional acquaintance.
I would highly recommend you find a broker who specializes in environmental insurance. This type of product is not like your auto coverage. It's not like your property coverage. It's not written on a standard form. So you really need to have somebody who understands the coverage specifically and is familiar with the different types of forms and coverages that are out there. There are about 40 or so different carriers writing environmental insurance, and you need to find and work with a broker who knows how to get to the carriers who are specializing in the type of exposures that you have. With regard to a carrier, I would advise on a couple of things. First, you want to make sure the carrier is financially stable. COVID-19 has caused a lot of economic uncertainty and a lot of losses in the industry in general, not necessarily the environmental industry, but the insurance industry. So you need to find a carrier who has very good, stable economic ratings. The second thing you want to look for is underwriters who are experienced and have been with a company for a long period of time. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, ask about the carrier's claim handling and claim handling team. There should be an internal claim handling team that the carrier has who is experienced in handling only environmental matters. And to Gordon's point, has experience in working with regulators in your jurisdiction, has relationships with them to find ways to, when there is a claim, get it resolved as quickly and as economically as possible. Honestly, we make educated guesses based on the available information, and we try to limit risk by things like retentions, which is the amount of money that the insured would be responsible for in any one particular claim. The length of the policy. We have the ability to write policies up to 10 years in length. But in situations where there's regulatory uncertainty, we try not to do so that if there is an issue or an issue changes, we can readdress it at that time. And then oftentimes we'll have to result to excluding certain chemicals. If there's just that much uncertainty that it's not really an insurable risk, then obviously we won't take that risk. Different companies take different tacks on things. About 3 or 4 years ago, AIG, who was at the time the largest writer of environmental insurance in the world, decided to stop writing site pollution policies because of loss history in the past. And so that created a bit of a vacuum. It allowed for new companies to come in, but it's also created a lot of different approaches to how things are generally done.
Most people have mechanisms for kind of winnowing down a universe to people who may be appropriate, through asking other people, et cetera, seeing who has written articles, been to conferences, that kind of thing. So then the question is, of that pool, kind of, what are the particular things that you may be looking for on your site? And I think you need to identify whether or not the issue requires somebody with particular regulatory experience. Is going to involve a lot of dealings with regulatory agencies and ask specific questions about what their contacts are and experiences with the relevant regulatory agencies. If it's something where you're not quite at that point and it's more a due diligence situation, and helping with transactional documents, and making sure that indemnities and disclosures of reps and warranties are all done correctly, and that the due diligence is done correctly, that the regulatory context may not be as important, and you may want just a very careful, fastidious lawyer. If it looks like it's going to be something that is really gnarly and may end up in litigation, then you may want a litigator. If it's not, I find that litigators probably aren't the best people for the other two types of things, which require a bit more of a friendly, collegial approach than a bulldog litigation approach. And then I would just say that you want someone who can balance the two issues that always have to be balanced. And one is that they will give you the bad news and tell you what the risks are and help you mitigate those risks. But that they won't over-exaggerate those, will be a problem solver and help you make something work. You're looking for that Goldilocks approach of advice, of someone who will be able to identify what that path is. And if someone seems to be really raising all sorts of alarms and not talking about how to solve them, or if someone seems to be really downplaying the risks and saying it's all going to be easy, be skeptical and ask some questions to make sure that they're not being either over alarmist or over optimistic.
Thanks, Gordon. I've been very blessed over my 30 years to work with both great counselors like Gordon and Barry, and I appreciate your participation in the panel.